Good morning, everyone, and yeah, welcome back to another Webinar Wednesday. Um, as I mentioned last week, those of you who are here remember, I am back in South Africa again. So it's good to be back. This is the first webinar we're doing with me being back, and today is going to be a bit of a different webinar because I just came back to the office and Bilal had to leave. So at this very moment, he's on his way to Johannesburg for some pretty big meetings. So it's just gonna be us for today. But the show must go on, and we didn't want to cancel the webinar completely. So um, for today, it'll just be me. But we have a pretty incredible topic, a really interesting topic, and one that I was pretty excited about before I even started researching this one. But as I did more and more research into this, I just ended up getting into it a lot more um, than I did before. So today we're going to be talking about React Native. Um, and it's something that we mentioned briefly in a webinar a few weeks ago, and we've promised that we would come back and do a full episode on it because it's something that deserves that kind uh, of attention, and you'll see why as we get into it. So here we are. Today we're just going to be talking about React Native, on what it is, on how to get started with it, and on why it's so incredible. So yeah, first of all, let's take it from the top. What is React Native? Now, many of you IT varsity students here today are probably really familiar with the term cross-platform app development. It's this technique of app development where you, instead of writing in native code, so for um, so instead of you writing in native codes, for example, for iOS, you would write in Swift, and for Android, you would write in Java or in Kotlin. And that would mean if you were a company and you wanted to develop an app that's going to be on all uh, devices out there, deployed on all of the app stores, you would need different teams to develop different versions of that app to then deploy onto every single platform that you wanted to. So you'd need a team to develop an Android version of that app for Android. You would need a team to develop an iOS version that's going to go on iOS. And then you'd need a team that sits somewhere in the middle and coordinates between those two teams to make sure that the apps match each other. And so, especially if you're releasing an update on one, you need to make sure that update is also available on the other. So that's where cross-platform app development comes in. Cross-platform simply means you develop an app once and you wrap it in such a way that it can then be deployed on Android and on iOS, as well as any other platforms that you wanted to deploy it on, for example, mobile. And so that obviously has the advantage of bringing development costs and development time way, way down. And so that's why over the past couple of years, we've seen a huge increase in cross-platform app development and frameworks catered to cross-platform app development. Uh, See, Bilal is in the comments. Morning. So uh, you couldn't sit out the webinar completely. You had to make an appearance. Cool. So yeah, so that's where cross-platform app development comes in. Um, Now React Native comes in and takes that to a whole new level because generally with cross-platform app developments, it's not an actual native app. It's a web app that's wrapped in a way and presented in a way that makes it appear like a mobile app. But at its core and the way it runs, it's just a mobile, it's just a web app. And that obviously has its limitations. Like you have to run it in a browser, whether it's an existing browser like Chrome or Safari or any of the other options out there, or whether you use something like PhoneGap to wrap it in its own little browser package. But it still is just a web app, and it has limitations, as in the UI isn't going to be, or the user interface isn't going to match the native counterparts. It's not going to be able to integrate with native features like the camera or the GPS or the vibration mechanics or any other native components that a phone would have. And that's obviously a problem because a lot of apps will call for that. And if you don't have the ability to access those, you are very, very limited in what kind of apps you can develop. So that's where React Native comes in. So although React Native is used for cross-platform app development, the benefits of, or the main advantage of React Native is that the apps you develop are native apps, right? And so that like completely blew my mind, when I started researching this more, because it's not a web app that looks like a mobile app. It is a native app, but it's built with JavaScript. You don't have to learn Swift or Java or Kotlin to now develop native apps. If you have a knowledge of JavaScript, if you know JavaScript, congratulations, you can now develop completely native mobile applications. And so just like cross-platform app development, this means you develop a code base once, and you can then deploy it on iOS and Android with no modifications. You can obviously go and tweak things here and there if you want, but it's not necessary. You can develop an app one time and deploy it on virtually any platform out there that you need to. Um, Now, again, unlike a lot of other frameworks out there, React Native is designed to make your apps, number one, extremely fast. It's a very well optimized framework, so you're not going to get lag even on older devices. It's going to be an extremely smooth, extremely fast app. But it also is meant to make your apps look and feel native. It's in the name, React Native. Um, Now, again, if you develop a web app and run it on mobile, you're going to be able to tell that it's not a mobile app, right? Unless you do a lot of work into making it look like a native app, but that is a lot of extra work that you're going to have to do. React Native does that straight out the door. It makes your app behave, it makes it look, it makes it feel like it's a native app, to the point where you can't even tell, you won't be able to tell the difference between an actual native app and an app developed with React Native. And you have probably used several apps that were developed using React Native, but you never knew it, right? So some of the really big examples would be Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and even Uber Eats, right? Now those apps, number one, you would notice that they are extremely fast. You never really have a problem with speed when it comes to those apps. And they look like native apps, right? But they are not. They are built using React Native. So that just shows you the power of React Native, what it's capable of. And it's an extremely powerful tool where companies of this size are using it for their apps. So if you had any doubts on whether you should uh, get into React Native, those should be put to rest by now. If not, wait, stick around. We've just started to dig into what makes React Native so incredible. Um, Now, again, just to summarize the benefits of what makes React Native so incredible. Number one, it's cross-platform, meaning you develop an app once and deploy it across multiple platforms, and but it's also truly native when you deploy it. It's not a mobile it's not a web app that looks like or that's presented in the way that it looks like a mobile app. It's a truly native app. Um, so you develop your code base once, and that obviously means development times, development costs are way down, but also importantly, maintenance is extremely easy. You don't have to maintain multiple code bases, or a company doesn't have to pay multiple teams to maintain each code base separately. You maintaining and developing just one code base, and then you redeploying that across multiple platforms. And the final, and I think one of the biggest benefits of React Native is that it uses JavaScript. So if you already know JavaScript, if you are already, or if you have been doing web development, you can use your existing skills to now develop completely native apps. You don't have to go and learn a completely new technology. There is still a bit of a learning curve to get through, but the core, the most important part of it, you should already know, meaning you can jump straight into it. So that's incredible, especially for IT varsity graduates, because you would know a bit of JavaScript, meaning you can then take that and easily transition into React Native and start developing purely native applications. Um, Now let's dive into some of the meat of React Native. It has some very cool features like allowing you to develop especially UI elements and then making it look like a native app. So how exactly does this happen? How does it work? It's actually really, really amazing. It's fantastic how they handle this. So when you're developing your UI, the user interface with React Native, React Native has its own components, its own JavaScript components that they developed purely for this platform, um, that you would use to lay out your user interface. Now these components look extremely similar to HTML. Although it's pure JavaScript, right? React Native doesn't use HTML or CSS, but the components that they developed for you to use to develop to design and build your user interface look identical to HTML and CSS. Um, so just like you would build a web page or a page using HTML with your tags, React Native has its own tags, and they are written exactly the same way, with your open angle bracket, the ID of the tag, your closing angle bracket, and then you have your closing tag at the end of the line. React Native has that exact same structure when you're designing this UI. And although the tags aren't exactly the same as the ones you'd get in HTML, but you can see the similarities, you can see the matches. So for example, React Native has a view tag, right? It's written as view, and its functionality is identical to a div ID in HTML. React Native has a text um, tag, and as you can guess, it's essentially a p tag, a paragraph tag, and it goes on. So there's the your button tags, there's image tags that you use, and although they are written slightly differently, they behave exactly the way as their HTML counterparts. And it doesn't just stop there. React Native has its own version of CSS as well. Um, so in the same document, again, it's pure JavaScript, but it's React Native's own components. And the syntax looks exactly like CSS. So you would use your colors, to adjust margins, to adjust the width and height of your view boxes or your, which are essentially div boxes or images. It looks exactly the same. Um, So if you know a bit of HTML and CSS, although again, React Native does not use HTML and CSS, but its own components are extremely similar, right? There's obviously a source of inspiration there, where they based their own components off of HTML and CSS. So if you know a bit of HTML and CSS, which all IT varsity students should know, it's going to make that learning curve of getting into React Native a lot easier. Okay. Guys, if you have any questions so far, if you're interested in learning more about React Native, now's the time, right? Remember, these are not supposed to be lectures. These are supposed to be an interactive session where you get to ask your questions, and we'll try to provide the best answers as we could. And I've actually got an announcement to make about that, but we'll get to that towards the end of this webinar. But if you have any questions or comments, let us know well, in the comment section, in the chat section. And we have one question so far. Do you need to know JavaScript before learning React and for getting into React Native? Yes, you do. So React Native is built on JavaScript, and the main language you'll be using is JavaScript. So I know a lot of people say you don't actually need to know JavaScript to get into it, but I don't think that's necessarily true, because it's going to make that learning curve so much easier. Um, I always think it's super, super important to understand the language first before you then go and use a framework. So understand how the basic language works and how to write basic applications using that language, and then you transition into um, using a framework. That way you have a more holistic understanding of the technology you're using. It's going to make you a much more competent and much more complete developer. So I do think it is important to know JavaScript before diving into React Native or React. So yeah, to get into React Native, that's what you need to know. If you know a bit of HTML and CSS, it's going to make your life a lot easier, or a little easier. It's going to make that learning curve slightly smoother. But again, it's not necessary to know those two, because you're not actually using HTML and CSS. You're using React's version of those that look similar. But I think if you do have a background in HTML and CSS, getting into designing UIs with React Native is going to be a lot easier for you, because you'll be able to visualize uh, exactly what you're doing. You're going to be understand what the React Native code is doing, uh, because of obviously your background in HTML and CSS. Uh, Now, when it comes to difficulty, how difficult is React Native? So as I mentioned before, there is a bit of a learning curve to it, um, especially when it comes to setting up. So okay, IT varsity students, for example, when developing new mobile apps with the technologies that you currently know, which is HTML5, you manually set up your development environment. So you'll go to your documents folder or your desktop, wherever it is you're building your project. You'll create a new folder, and then you manually add your files. So you'll create your first HTML file, you'll call it index.html, save it, and then you manually add pages after that. React Native doesn't exactly work like that. You use what's called a command line interface, a CLM, to set up your projects. So there is a learning curve into getting your head around how those work. But once you do understand it, then it's there to make your life a lot easier, because you don't have to go and manually do everything. You just type in a few lines into your command prompt, hit enter, and React Native handles it for you. So for example, setting up a project, you go into your command line, you type in some lines of code, you hit enter, you wait a minute or two, and your entire project is set up for you, or the structure of it. Your first couple pages are there. All of the things that needed to be imported and linked up together are all done already. You just need to open it up in your text, in your editor, and start coding. So there is a learning curve to it, but once you get past that, it's pretty easy. It's there to make your life very easy. Um, Again, if you know HTML and CSS, that learning curve is going to be slightly easier, um, because you're going to have an understanding of what you're doing, even though it isn't actually HTML and CSS. Um, Now, when it comes to getting into React Native, there's two ways you can go. And again, this is why React is so amazing. You can write React Native using pure, what they call pure React Native or React Native CLM. Um, and now this version of React Native has everything that React Native has to offer. It has all of the tools at your disposal. Um, and it even has some libraries from iOS and Android that you can import and use, which is good and all, but it also means it's a lot harder, and there's a lot more going on, and you would need to know a bit about, number one, development with React Native, but also number two, you'll need to know a little bit of coding, a little bit of app development with for native Android and iOS apps, because it includes libraries from Android and iOS. So you have all of that power, but it is a lot more difficult. Alternatively, you can work with Expo, which is a framework for React Native. Right? React Native itself is a framework, and Expo now is a framework that sits on top of that framework. Um, And Expo, what Expo does is it hides almost all of that complexity. So it makes the journey of setting up and developing your first app extremely, extremely smooth. To the point where if you know a bit of JavaScript and you know what you're doing, you could get into Expo, into React Native using Expo, and have your first app developed in only a few minutes. Literally, just a few minutes. So that's the beauty of Expo. And from there, you can always transition into pure React Native. And you can even convert your apps over. So you export your Expo project into a true React Native project, and it'll add in all of the missing libraries and things that and tools that you were missing out. So for someone who's just getting into React Native, get started with Expo. And then from there, if you need to, you can transition into pure React Native. But truth is, for the majority of apps that you'll be developing, you probably won't need to use anything beyond Expo. Uh, and then here's the final amazing thing that I love about React Native, and that is testing. You know, it's always good to test your apps as you're going along. So there's two options when it comes to React Native. One is a simulator on your PC. Um, you can even run it in your browser, just like how you test out your HTML5 apps. There are also a few other simulators out there, which makes prototyping and testing super easy. Um, but simulators do have their limitations. They don't have all of the features and all of the components that an actual phone has. And so running it on a phone would obviously reveal a few other things that a simulator might not. Which brings me to option two of testing your apps. So for your mobile phone, for Android and iOS, there's an app called Expo Go or Expo Client. That is an emulator on your phone to test your React Native apps. Now, normally you would need to deploy your app onto your mobile device every single time you want to test, which can take a long time, and it's a bit of an annoying process to go through every time, especially if you're making small changes here and there. So with this app, the Expo Client app, what you do is you save your code on your PC. It gives you a QR code. You scan the QR code with your phone, and it instantly runs your code on your phone. So you can keep testing on your phone as if it's connected, as if you're doing like a live deployment, because essentially you are. So you make any code to your PC on your PC. You save, you refresh on your phone, and you have your app running on your mobile device as if it's fully deployed. So that again makes testing a breeze. It's super easy. Um, so I wasn't even planning to get into React Native fully. Uh, I had just dabbled in it before, but it's come a long, long way. And after doing all of this research for this webinar, I actually fell in love with this platform. So I'm going to be spending a lot of time developing with React Native. And I want you guys, especially IT varsity students, to get into this because um, the basics you already know, especially if you completed Entrepreneur. You're going to have a basic understanding of app development. You're going to have a basic understanding of JavaScript, which again is needed to get into React Native. Plus, you're going to know a bit of HTML and CSS, which is going to make your transition into UI design using React Native a lot easier. And as I mentioned, if you're using Expo, which I highly recommend you do, you could get started and get your first app out there in just a few minutes. So that's your homework for this week. We don't normally give homework in these webinars, but IT varsity students, or even if you're not an IT varsity student and you're watching this, go ahead and get started with React Native. See just how easy it is to get started. I mean, there is that learning curve, especially to the first few steps on installing React Native and setting up your first project. But uh, I give you guys 2 hours max, and you're going to be well beyond that. You're going to be, you'd probably have your first app built by then. So that's what I want you guys to do. Between this week's webinar and next week's webinar, go ahead, familiarize yourself with React Native, get it installed on your PC, and develop your first app using React Native. Doesn't have to be complicated, just a simple Hello World app that just shows some text that says Hello World, and then share that with us. Post it on your socials and tag us. Let's have a look at what you did. I want to see which one of you actually manages to produce something and who can do it first, right? It's a competition, a little friendly competition between IT varsity students. Uh, and again, before we close off, if you have any questions, please let us know. Bilal says, please do a detailed React and Expo tutorial. That is something that we are working on, and something that hopefully within the next few weeks will roll out. We're going to be making a full tutorial or a full basic course, an introduction course to React Native on how to set up and how to get started with your first with building and testing your first apps. Um, but until that comes out, let's see which one of our IT varsity students can produce an app on their own. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with. So yeah, get started, and before next week's webinar, send us some pictures, either directly or post it on social media and tag us in it. Uh, so until then, until next week, thank you guys so much for joining. Uh, hope you learned a lot from this webinar, and you hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, researching it. And yeah, we'll see you guys next week. Okay, bye everyone.